Hello, my name is Chris Nayve. I am the Associate Vice President for Community Engagement at the University of San Diego. And I also lead our anchor initiatives. I've been at the university and in higher education for over 20 years. And I would say fundamentally and broadly, my goal or what my work is that I work in community and economic development at the University of San Diego. I also lead our place-based and our anchor initiatives, which fundamentally means that I work to develop partnerships between our campus and the community, as well as our region, to make sure that our campus community is really involved in some of the most pressing issues affecting our region. That is my title, and that is what I do. And then I would say that my work is about the practice of joining, and how do I do that? Thinking about this question, I was thinking about my work within the context of who signs my paycheck and what's my title. And then going deeper, I just felt compelled to start by saying that actually, going beyond my title and going beyond where it is I work, I started to think, well, what is it that I'm drawn towards? And, when I think about this question, I'm realizing that I'm just drawn towards building relationships that really allow us to be visible and to be more fully who we are. I think when I think of my work from there, then everything else can kind of broaden a little bit. And if my work starts there, it helped me think about this idea of the work as part of what my colleagues call the practice of joining. And my colleagues John Loggins and Esteban Del Rio actually wrote an article in Kumu about this idea of the practice of joining, about how do we integrate mindfulness, how do we integrate attentiveness to kind of really build relationships, especially as it relates to campus and community. So, I was just on a panel this past week on the idea of our work as a practice. So it is fresh on my mind, and it may seem a little bit abstract to think of my work as this practice, but when I thought about it within the context of, well, what is it that I'm drawn towards, that really started to make a little bit more sense for me. And it also means that, I'm trying to have no separation between how I treat my family and how I treat those I'm in the office with, or folks I interact with in the community. It doesn't always work because I'm human, but I guess that is why I struggle when on my days where, say, maybe I'm patient with and connected with colleagues, or in the community, I'm really connected with some of the folks that we're doing some really kind of important partnership work with. But then yet I'm not able to be patient at home. For me, that drives home the idea that congruence is really important work for me. And so I had to flip this idea of what is my work so I can think about what I do as a practice and how I want to be. And so it just so happens that I'm drawn to the field of community and civic engagement and public service, and in particular in higher education, where I feel the practice of joining and community building are really important elements of what we do. And I also think framing what I do as a vocation and practice, it also means that it could be universally applied to wherever I go. Now, I'm lucky that I get to be working in a space that I really enjoy working in. I think it also means that if my work is a daily practice, it could be applied anywhere I go. I sometimes have dreams of being a chef, but I know if I had a restaurant, for example, having the restaurant would really be secondary to how I treat those who I share the workplace with. And I think I look back, regardless of where I've worked or where I've been, this idea of building relationships is something I've always been drawn towards. And in our field of community engagement and community development and how we define this work broadly, the practice of building strong relationships is really important. And early on when I was thinking of this work, early in my career, I was thinking, well, my work as my title, my identity tied up into my title and who signs my paychecks. I just found it really hard to define what I do. My parents would always ask, like, well, what is it that you do? And I always I never had a great answer. I wish I always had a great answer. And sometimes I would think, well, my job is to catalyze the mission of higher education in order to solve the most pressing social issues. And it's like, hello, ego. So I think now I just firmly believe that my work is focused on how I can be in the service of the idea that what our colleagues at Rutgers Newark express. I love how they call what it is they do. They say 1 + 1 = 3 because we're really more than the sum of our parts. And just as an example to that, when I started getting into more leadership roles, I realized that I do bring some strengths and skills to the table, and there are a lot of things that I don't bring to the table. And I'm so appreciative to work with so many great collaborators and team members, and some of them, John Loggins and Maria Silva and others, and they have strengths and skills that I don't bring. And indeed, they're like these wonderful and brilliant humans, and they lift everyone up around them. So I want to be standing in the service of that and lifting up their brilliance. So to me, that's the 1 + 1 = 3. To me, that's the sweet spot of, I guess, how I would define what is my work. It's not tense or territorial. It's open, it's expansive. It still can be critical. It just means that we're clear that the critique is about advancing our shared values and not shutting things down. I think of any of the collaborations with people that were truly co-created. It's not that they're easier without conflict, but just typically the work is so much more connected because it's not driven by ownership, but it's collective. So, I guess for me, I'm committed that my work is about the practice of joining. It's to connect with people. It's to uplift their strengths and assets. And when I think of my work through that lens, it just keeps me hopeful that I can do that wherever I am. How I come to this work, the genesis for me is joining the Navy when I was 17, right out of high school, because I didn't have much of a plan. And the military loves young people who don't have a plan. And so after 5 years serving everywhere from a submarine to being a combat medic during the Bosnian War, I really have to credit that time as my entree into public service. And when I was in Bosnia, there were a few times where I would have an opportunity to go into the headquarters of the United Nations, and I would see all these international community development professionals. And I just remember my interest being piqued. I was like, who are all these folks? Where are they coming from all over the world? And then I would, as my time in Bosnia expanded, I would, have a chance to go into some places where there were refugees from the war. And I would see all these young people from around the world just really contributing and essentially wanting to help. I couldn't define it at the time, but I know that is the shift that was happening for me. This entree into, well, what is this idea of community development? Fast forward a little bit, that was still in the 1990s. I had a chance to work for the U.S. Housing and Urban Development, and they used to have an Office of University Partnerships. And they had these COPSI grants, or Community Outreach Partnership Center grants. They're very similar to the community engagement centers you have there in Homewood and the Hill District. And let me just kind of say that those are like important centers. And for me, really the future of partnerships between higher ed and communities. And of course, Darren and Kirk are powerfully leading those spaces. But, I was involved with USD's version of those community engagement centers. And again, we call those COPSIs. They were co-located in the community. And after a couple of years, a position opened up at the center that I'm currently at the University of San Diego, which is called the Karen and Tom Mulvaney Center for Community Awareness and Social Action. So that is when my time in higher ed started. Again, by this point, it was the mid-90s. And I would categorize our work broadly as community development. And I would say I was drawn towards the goals and aspirations of the 1964 Civil Rights Acts and the 1965 Higher Education Act about fulfilling the promise of equal protection in schools, education, housing, law, and economic development. And the broad work of community development and economic development was really about living up to those promises. So, I really started in the field only. It's strange to think, because at the time it felt like there was a lot of separation. Um, Only 3 decades later, in the 90s. By then, Clinton had signed in 1993 the National and Community Service Trust Act. That was reauthorized in 2009 by President Obama to increase civic engagement. And so professionally, during that time of 1990 to 1998 is when I think I fully jumped into what I'm doing today. Since then, the field has experienced a lot of really important moments and toward more critical community commitments, like the advancement of service learning, community engagement, democracy building, and civic participation. And in relation to higher education, we know that fully integrating a civic and community engagement mission, it just has to be integral to any institution of higher learning. So in the panel I was in a couple of weeks ago, where we talked about our approach to the work and this idea that our work is our practice, I was really reflecting on the scholar, administrator, practitioner model that recognizes the multiple identities to this work. And Lena, you've done so much work in this space, really along with other colleagues who have been pressing us to consider how our roles could advance our institutional missions, right? In a way that was much more expansive, and in a way that really considered this work as a practice. We're not merely administrators. I think for me, it was helpful, that framework moved us from transactional work to relational work. If it is transactional, then it doesn't matter who is there, because I don't have to see the inherent assets and gifts that you bring. But as colleagues at George Mason University said, I heard them once reflect on, is that, you partner with individuals and not just institutions. And if we could take those relationships and the strengths and assets of others, and then, then we're really moving toward a much more transformational practice. So I know, as someone who's helping to lead people, I know the work is about coaching and mentoring and lifting up. If I have to be different at work than at home, it's no wonder for me why I'm tired all the time. However, if my practice is how do I build stronger relationships that allow us to be more fully who we are, and if my practice is implied in that context, then I feel, my work is how Father Boyle, who leads Homeboy Industries, says it's the practice of ensuring that no one stands outside that circle of compassion. Well, in thinking about my sphere of influence and positionality, I want to build on the idea that my work is about deepening and strengthening relationships and lifting up others, and really being in the service of that. So it does go back to this idea of the practice of joining, and how do we get to this place of co-creation and reciprocity. And, I was thinking in the case of, say, faculty and community. And in this recent example, this is literally just a couple of weeks ago, where, we were helping with this partnership between some faculty members and some community members on this issue of homelessness. And literally, there were two different ideas of how that meeting went. You had faculty members who left the meeting feeling like they were really able to get their research agenda and their questions answered. And to them, everything was great. In my debrief with community members, they said they really enjoyed the faculty members as people. They were reflecting that it would have just been great if they can speak without the academic agenda always being so front and center. So to me, they were wanting to join, but the roadblock to joining was that the community member felt that the university agenda was much more important than the community agenda, and there was no alignment. So, I want to use my positionality and sphere of influence to role model joining. From there, it is important for me to show through my actions how to build strong community ties. It's not very scientific. For me, it's things like, how are you kind to people? How do you see each other? How do you show up without an agenda? Maybe we bring food. When we are on immersions with faculty and students in communities around the world, I'm happy sometimes to just drive the van and just listen and talk, truly do engage in a way where we are fully present. It may not seem very scholarly, but those relationships that are built on that kind of strong tie, to me, that kind of humanity really creates much deeper pathways to collaboration and trust. When we don't do those things, I think they also really reveal some of the big tensions and cracks between campus and community. So coming to that wasn't easy. I mean, I've really had to accept and be open to the fact that I do have positionality and influence. I say that because I still often feel like I'm an outsider to academia. And because in the work we do, we're always trying to build a bridge for access and inclusion and equity into a space that by its nature is not accessible, equitable, or inclusive. You have to pass the test to be accepted, and you have to apply and be evaluated on standards that could be completely different than what I am used to. I recognize that's the process of higher education. However, there is a polarity, in the evaluation process of higher education. So I think that being said, being in my role at the university and beyond, I've had to really learn to embrace my influence and be intentional about how to use my leadership in a way that truly elevates people and communities. And to be in the service of that is how I want to use my influence and positionality. Why do we name it, why do we articulate a liberatory and critical community engagement practice? Why do we consider that work to be counter-normative? For me, articulating a commitment to liberatory and critical community engagement, is in the same spirit of why we do land acknowledgements. It's why we're interested in the narratives of people, because it's the truth. It means we are going to do what Tania implored in her critical service learning article, which is strive towards authenticity, collaboration, and collective work rooted in justice and equity. Because critical and liberation-focused community engagement is different than transactional and charitable endeavors. Sometimes one-time events are needed. A hurricane hits, power goes out in a large state, and we need that immediate mutual aid. But when, traditional community engagement only stays in the charity space, it is bound and conditioned. And actually, it's not free, and often potentially fraught with oppression. So liberatory and critical community engagement for me is built for the long haul. It's generational work, and it's not focused on quarters or semesters. And when a practice of engagement is rooted in assets and building relationships, compassion and kinship and anything not in the service of that cannot in their nature be in the spirit of liberation. So liberatory and critical community engagement is about freedom, truth, sovereignty. It's without conditions. If conditions exist, they have to be co-created. Otherwise, it's not mutuality or reciprocity. For example, I have a research project to help facilitate through between campus and community. And community members then have to meet the terms of the university, which is like a 25% overhead cost. Well, that's transactional. That's not relational. And I'm saying we can have a university community partnership, but then I really only want to engage from late September to early December because I have finals, and then good luck in the hard winter months while we're on break. Those are conditions, but think to the relationships that have transcended a lot of those typical barriers. Think of the faculty member who shows up, to community meetings at night, after class with no agenda, or the community leader that still comes to the classroom to share their project with students despite all the challenges they may have had going on in their life. To me, that is the kinship that is linked with freedom, not because there are no politics or issues, but I think in spite of those issues, we make this commitment to each other. If we describe our work broadly and in that way, that connects to community and economic development as it relates to fulfilling the promise of what I talked about earlier, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Higher Education Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, that we know we still have this long, long way to go. And then we have to ask, well, what's the role of higher education in working toward the public good? I recently heard Heather McGhee talk brilliantly about her new book called The Sum of Us, which I have not yet read, but I want to. And she describes the economic and social cost of racism. What struck me was her notion that society is so polarized that, especially over race, in her research, she found that people were still willing to give up benefits if another group of people who didn't look like me or another community that does not look like me benefits. She found people she interviewed felt like they would lose something, right? So if a different group is advocating for something, that group does not look like me, even if what they're advocating for benefits me, I'm gonna not sign on to it. She talked about this idea, I think why she called the title The Sum of Us, is because it really goes to this idea that currently society feels like we're in this zero-sum game. It's unlike what I talked about earlier, which is 1 + 1 equaling 3, that we're greater than the sum of our parts. Actually, what she describes is this notion of, if I win, you lose, right? And then in her research, she really did talk about specifically people in unions who voted against their best interest because their Black coworkers were for a certain policy, even if it meant foregoing a higher wage or equitable healthcare. She ends up calling for this idea of solidarity benefits, meaning like, so if I support a living wage or healthcare, even if I don't need it, or access to education, or affordable housing, then as a society, we all benefit. I've been thinking about what she's been talking about quite a bit. As we go into 2021, there is this cautious optimism, but there is not necessarily a lot of liberatory feelings of freedom going on right now. And in fact, as a society and world, there's a lot of trauma, from the pandemic to calls for dismantling systemic racism. There are actually a lot of important discussions and actions about what to do about historical monuments, for example. But I heard somebody say recently that trauma is also a monument. So how do we understand that trauma? Because, unfortunately, the conditions that created the monument of trauma, it cannot be easily removed. So I think our work, our practice of joining and how we lift up and advance liberatory and critical community engagement, free of any conditions is very, very paramount. For us on our campus, and what we're learning from many other campuses and communities is that the practice of joining really requires us to go beyond the statement of solidarity. It really means being strategic and pervasive. As an example, our campus and many other campuses who use a civic action plan that National Campus Compact helped to facilitate, and how we tie that with our campus strategic plan, they actually explicitly now write 4 ways to dismantle systems of oppression. I should also add that liberatory and critical community engagement must be done with humility and without conditions. So, for all those reasons, that is why I think being forthright with why using a liberatory and critical community engagement lens is so vitally important. So we can create a theory of change that provides a co-created blueprint for self-determination that is long-term and transformational. Anchor institution work really gets its origins right around the time of the signing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And I would say that, with the rise of globalization and as industries were leaving communities decimated, all these interventions between anchor institutions, especially educational institutions, large educational institutions, large medical institutions, or what they call the eds and meds, said, look, we can kind of step in and intervene and ensure that communities remain intact. And, that really had a broad reach as it relates to full economic inclusion, full housing inclusion, and equal protection under the law post 1964. I think anchor institution work as it relates to higher education, really started taking root. Some credit, I think, a 2001 Aspen Institute conversation that named and coined the term anchor institutions to say, how do we commit long-term to place, to a region, to a community? And there's also a parallel movement called the place-based community engagement approach that similarly commits long-term. And it really is about saying, what is our commitment to place? How do we develop long-term reciprocal community partnerships that are both democratic and reciprocal? And then how do we focus on some critical issues like hiring, like supply chain, like small business assistance, like workforce development, affordable housing, access to education?